Hello, this is Jordan, and today I'll be presenting the book Space Between People: How Virtual Changes Physical Architecture. It's authored by various people and edited by Stephan Doesinger. For starters, this book uses a magazine-like format to display various topics and multiple perspectives of the content. It is arranged in small sections with larger chapters. Before we jump right in, I'd like to briefly talk about the general themes and ideas of Space Between People. As stated, this is an architecture book, but the focus does not necessarily lie on architectural structures or design. It approaches the topic of virtual architecture more from a philosophical and conceptual perspective. It is separated into three main sections, that being space, between, and lastly, people. Though I decided to break this down into major topics and themes. The key topics that will be discussed are space, philosophies, second lives, and architecture. Space is one of the most important concepts addressed. The authors note various types of space and what they encompass. They also go into great detail about concepts like utopias and virtualization, which I lumped into philosophies. As the virtual architecture addressed exists within Second Life, the concept of second lives, their history, and social aspects have been focused on. Lastly, as architecture is the main focus of the entire book, everything will be drawn to a close within the architecture section. The first space introduced is bastard space. Bastard space is addressed by Doesinger, who defines it as occupying both a physical and mental space at the same time. Working similarly to Huizinga's magic circle, bastard spaces create a distorted reality. Some examples of bastard spaces are the space that you inhabit when you talk on a cell phone or when you're listening to music. Doesinger defines elements of bastard spaces in the Bastard Spaces Manifesto, which states 11 points, most of which apply to the other main topics. These elements being: the world is a computer game, architecture is the space between people, iconography kills imaginary, buildings are obstacles, the earth is a blood-crusted disco ball driven by satellites, inside and out equals pull and push, ambition and artificial light are the strongest building materials, bastard spaces are where physical spaces merge with media spaces, public space is media construction, film is space and time, architecture is time and space, and last, become the needle of a record player scratching along facades. The second space addressed is public space. Public space is mentioned by multiple writers in both positive and negative connotations, but it is ultimately defined as the sum of bastard spaces by Doesinger. Public space can be physical or virtual, and occurs in the public eye and works as a media construct. Basically, wherever there are cameras and content is edited, you'll have a public space. In public spaces, people are consumers of information and under the supervision of media and government. Privacy is forfeit, and in doing just that, we show ourselves off to the world, granting us a little bit of power. Moving on to virtual spaces are exactly that, virtual. They are affected by media and contained within invisible space. Though they can affect our behavior, the physical spaces do coexist with virtual. Virtual spaces do not have to be technology bound and don't truly have an effect on our lives. The last spaces covered are directly connected to social utilities, which will be discussed at a later point. These spaces are the agree and disagree spaces within Second Life. These spaces are virtual meeting places within Second Life where users try to copy the functions of offline discussion. This space is divided into specific zones: the agree and disagree area, where users either agree or disagree with the point being made by the moderator, who manages the space of course. The sidelines and observation areas are for those who wish to participate in the discussion but not make a claim for one side or the other, as well as those who just want to be onlookers. These spaces occur in real time and require users to physically position themselves in the selected space. All of these spaces influence the architecture of virtual spaces. As virtual space has different limitations from the real world, the function of a space and what happens in a virtual space is vital for the architecture of virtual worlds, which in turn is influenced by and influences the real world architecture designs and decisions. As we move past spaces, the concept of utopia is given to the readers. The idea of a utopia stems from Thomas More's book Utopia, written in 1516. This composes the classical definition of a utopia, which is an ideal society. Authors of this section, Stefan Kramer and Maximilian Schick, compare and contrast this classical ideal with the features of Second Life. Though they conclude that no such utopia exists, they explore and bring to light the fact that Second Life is not limited like the physical world. It has no central ideas, and its complexity is in its users who create its content, not in Second Life itself. At the same time, Second Life reflects the ideals of these users, has growth limits, and just isn't as alive as reality is. These aspects, combined with the fact that different people have different views on what makes an ideal society, make Second Life fall from being a utopia. Second Life is a reality like our reality, and it's not perfect to everyone. Virtualization is the second big concept. In short, the distinction between virtual and real is virtualization. It occurs in degrees and can be of different types based on the context. This virtualization draws heavily from imaginary architecture. That is, architecture that exists as ideas and drawings than actual traditional architecture. We can categorize virtualization by the places in which it applies. Fictitious places are places that are completely imaginary. They are open source architecture and can often have difficulty or not translate at all into the real world. Of course, hybrid places are those that are fictional but reflect real ideas and real things of our world, and the last are just virtual real spaces or metaphors for real spaces. Through virtualization, we can find new forms of architecture. As we are talking about Second Life's architecture, it's important to know what a Second Life is besides the application. A Second Life does not have to be a user within Second Life, but rather is the act of portraying a different life. The idea of a Second Life traces back to medieval times and the carnivals where peasants would swap roles with nobles. A Second Life can occur regularly, like when we play Monopoly. We refer to our properties as ours and the board pieces as ourselves. As for the actual Second Life, it has no true history, as it doesn't follow the same cultural or social norms as reality. Social utilities refer to the systems that support social interactions within the spaces of Second Life. Social utilities are basically the social norms of the virtual world. They act as the framework for virtual social environments. Now we've arrived at the main topic of the book, the actual architecture. Virtual architecture is very different from physical architecture. It has nuances and is made ambiguous purposely. It is not bound by the same limits as physical space, just by the sims and prims by which it is created in and with. The space of virtual architecture is fluid and easily interchangeable. Though virtual architecture can be very abstract, it is just as real as physical architecture, and it exists within a space where people dwell. Buildings in both the physical and virtual world have potential to influence behavior. The function follows the form. This means the function is unknown until the building informs you of its purpose. Buildings restrict space, and in doing so create new social spaces. In Second Life, we are provided with the builder's goals and the perceptions of the building by the actual users. Social architecture is the culmination of all acts meant to remove physical limitations of the real world from the virtual. As architecture is the space between people, projects developed for social means are social architecture. Social architecture has no historical centers, and Second Life generally views squares as centers as useless or negative spaces. Public and private spaces are also given little attention, as everyone is always on the move and no one is just part of one community. For a second, we will take a look more into the architecture of reality. We do things very differently from Second Life. We have many centers and squares and historical monuments. These famous feats of architecture have become symbols of themselves, while the actual locations are floodlit, decorated, or renovated, providing imitations of our lost history. Actual monuments are losing their significance, and various architecture projects are based on specific spaces or economic goals. Second Life allows free development, where the authors believe true architecture will be created. On top of this, we see a huge change in architecture focuses, as the perceptions of architects change. Architects were seen as visionaries and artists, whereas now they seem to be part of a process. To add, there is a large and ever-growing technological and cultural gap between the architects of different generations, as some are accustomed to more virtual elements and different ways of viewing architecture. There are benefits to working in a virtual environment, but we cannot neglect the workings of reality if we expect the virtual worlds to adopt real-life elements. Finally, we come to the products of virtual architecture. Various architectural creations have been created within Second Life, often appearing as things unattainable in reality. Many of these creations are unclassifiable, but in years to come we can expect more virtual architectural practices to merge into our reality. The last things the book leaves us with are some various designs and concepts of art within Second Life. One of my favorite architectural pieces is the Living Cloud, a self-contained moving home that provides your avatar with a house wherever you go. In conclusion, I think it was really cool to see the drastic differences in architecture. Though the book was troublesome to read at times, the concepts all came together, and despite the various views, they produced a full informational work. Though video games were not mentioned often, their minor notes were important and interesting on top of that. Most of the authors seem to believe that the future of architecture is being made within video games, and that the future of architects seem to be guided towards making virtual architecture for video games, which I think is pretty cool. This concludes my presentation on Space Between People, How the Virtual Changes Physical Architecture. Thanks for listening.